So this is ORDI asking neurologists to do a series. So thank you, Mr. Prasanna, for this opportunity. But Mr. Prasanna, I always felt that it would be great for us to talk about things. So here's to the wonderful job that ORDI does, and thanks to ORDI team for creating this platform and bringing us together. Not much formalities because we are not people who do a lot of formalities. We've asked a simple an inaugural function. We've asked Dr. Pratibha Singh and Dr. Naita to inaugurate the event. The kickoff to this series, which we hope is a fantastic series. We hope everybody would enjoy it. Dr. Naita doesn't need any introduction. She's our dynamic the president of the AOCN, working as a pediatric neurologist, working in SRCC, Wadi, and JESLOC, and the executive board member for the current International Child Neurology Association, and Dr. Pratibha Singh, madam, who is a pioneer in pediatric neurology in India, setting up the department in PGI and now heading the department, the director in Medanta, but most importantly, putting us on the world map as the president-elect of ICNA and the current secretary to ICNA. Welcome, madam.
Thank you.
If you wish a few words, and then we hand over to the symposia to the moderators.
Yeah, thank you, Anne. I think it's a wonderful thing to have a collaborative endeavor like this, and it brings out the best in both the societies. And of course, it's beneficial for the participants. And we can share a lot through such things. And of course, congratulations to you for setting it up and to the AOCN. And we hope that together we will take it forward. And if there's anything ICNA can support further, we'll be happy to do so. So best of luck. Without wasting time, go ahead.
Thank you. And from my side, just to thank you, ORDI, Mr. Prasanna, for planning to have this web series in rare diseases in pediatric neurology. And a big thanks to Anne for putting it all together. The effort and the energy, trust me, is humongous what she has done. And the program looks fantastic. So I think we're all in for a treat for the next 1.5 months. And we as AOCN are very happy to partner with ORDI for this. All the best for all the events.
3.5 months, madam.
3.5 months.
Mr. Prasanna, if you would please say something. I know you all do a fantastic job, and you put Karnataka on Indian map, thanks to the work you all do.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. In fact, it gives me immense pleasure to invite all of you to this season 2 of ORDI, Care for Rare webinar series. ORDI, for the doctors who are not aware about ORDI, ORDI is an umbrella organization working mainly in the area of advocacy, awareness, and patient support. As a part of ORDI awareness program, last year we started this Care for Rare webinar series. Apart from individual doctors speaking on individual subject, we started season 1 with IAMG, Indian Academy of Medical Genetics, with 13 sessions, 39 topics, and 52 experts. And now season 2 in association with AOCN, with 75 speakers and moderators, 45 topics, and for 15 sessions. Probably this is one of the largest series in rare diseases and neuromuscular neurology in India and probably the world too, and especially focusing on rare diseases. So I take the opportunity to thank Dr. Anne first for her energetic and putting this beautiful program. We have received a lot of applause from all the people who have received our invitation about fantastic program, and also Dr. Anaita Hegde and AOCN for supporting this initiative of ours. And I'm personally happy to see such events, as my journey started in the rare disease advocacy field with my daughter, who diagnosed as Pompe, one of the first Pompe patient way back in 2007. And my experience in getting it diagnosed for 7 years and managing from last 21 years. I hope these sessions will provide more insights, new way of looking at existing complex situation, new way of looking at patients, and finally benefiting of patient community in early diagnosing and better management. I think on behalf of all rare disease patient community in India, I thank everyone for putting this entire team, and also speakers and moderator who accepted our invitation, and more importantly, all the doctors who have logged in and spending their valuable time to this important session. I wish the entire team, community, all the best, and hope this will be one of the best series in India. Thank you, Dr. Ann.
So thank you, Mr. Prasanna, for giving us this platform and bringing us together during these difficult times. So on to the series moderators, Dr. Shruti, who is a neuromuscular expert from Sri Chitra Hospital, an apex neurological center in the country, a central government body. Dr. Shruti and Dr. Renu Sitar from PGI Chandigarh. On to both of you.
So good evening all. I welcome you all for the first session of Neuromuscular Symposium today. I thank Organization of Rare Disease in India, Dr. Ann, for having this session here. And for this session today, we have three very interesting topics and three very eminent speakers. Each talk will be about for 30 minutes, and then we have a Q&A session for 30 minutes in the last, at the end of the three topics. So the first session is on spinal muscular atrophy, and we have Dr. Shefali for that for this topic. Madam need no introduction. She is a leading pediatric neurologist of India. She is a head of pediatric neurology at AIIMS New Delhi, and she emulate lots of roles with the clinician, teacher, a researcher, and now she is president-elect of AOCN. So I invite Dr. Shefali for the first topic. Welcome, ma'am, and
Thank
over
you.
to you.
I thank Anne and ORDI and the moderators. Can I share the screen? Can you enable me to share the screen, please?
You can share it. There is a share button below.
Yeah, I'm sharing. Yeah, I was just asking for enabling. Yeah. Okay. Is it full screen now? Can you see full screen?
Yes, now
okay. Yeah. We'll go through spinal muscular atrophy, how, I have no disclosures. The outline would be talking about the motor unit, the motor neuron disease, a general approach to these children, and especially the floppy children, and SMA, how do you diagnose, what are the recent advances in management, and we should not forget the holistic multidisciplinary management, genetic counseling, on our experience, what we have had, and I'll briefly touch upon SMA variants or MND plus syndromes. Basically, this motor unit is very important when we are trying to understand, any neuromuscular disease. Anything going wrong anywhere in the motor unit is going to manifest in neuromuscular weakness. So classically, the neuromuscular disorder with the anterior horn cell involvement will lead to spinal muscular atrophy. So just briefly talking about the motor neuron disease, basically it's a heterogeneous group of progressive disorders resulting in difficulty in walking, moving, breathing, and swallowing, with onset very variable from early childhood, to adulthood. And there is weakness and atrophy from the disruption of lower motor neuron and or spasticity from upper motor neuron dysfunction. And they can be genetic or acquired. Genetic classically is SMA, which we will be talking about most of the time. And then you will have SMA variants, MND plus syndrome, which we will just be mentioning. And you have acquired causes, viral infections with Coxsackie, enterovirus, echo, polio, West Nile, toxins, paraneoplastic, and immune mediated. All of them also can present as motor neuron diseases. How common are they? SMA1 has been reported in 1 in 6,000 to 1 in 10,000, and SMA2 and 3 in 1 in 24,000. And non-5q SMAs are extremely rare, and they're clinically and genetically heterogeneous. And a number of causative genes have been increasing with the NGS for the non-5q SMAs. When you approach a child with a suspected neuromuscular disorder, when you have proximal muscle weakness with absent reflexes, with tongue fasciculations may be there, and a relatively static course, you suspect an anterior horn cell disease. And whenever you are approaching a child, we should always see age at onset, what was the clinical pattern, what's the functional capacity of the child, what is the anatomical localization we are trying to do, what are the involvement outside the skeletal muscle, how has been the disease course, what is the inheritance we're talking about, and what means for securing a diagnosis are available. And obviously treatment options, please do not forget the multidisciplinary supportive care. And obviously, yes, the specific ones which are there, but the multidisciplinary supportive care remains the mainstay and should not be forgotten. So is it a neuromuscular problem? We have to know at the end of the history and examination whether we can localize it to anywhere in the motor unit, what is the etiopathogenesis, acquired, hereditary, static or progressive, and any possible causes you get from cues from the history and the current functional status of the child. So in a floppy infant, what we will generally see, if you have depressed reflexes and a poor muscle power, that suggests peripheral hypotonia, and that points to an anterior horn cell disease. And although you can have neuromuscular junction and muscle problem too, but one should just keep in mind that you may have brisk reflexes and can be there with central hypotonia. And my problem point was mentioning there at this point is there can be many cases where you have a mixed picture. So you have to understand the child holistically with the history and examination. Coming to SMA, see SMA when it was diagnosed, it was mentioned briefly. It was described in 1891 and 93. After that, in 1995, you got the discovery of the SMN gene, and we have come a long way with the gene therapy and all coming up now. So basically, from it has come lots of things. Now you have gene therapy and you have many other treatment options and many more things going on. But again, I'm mentioning again, don't forget the multidisciplinary follow-up. So generally SMA type 1, you have an onset below 6 months of age, and SMA type 2 less than 18 months, and SMA type 3 more than 18 months. They have symmetrical weakness, both trunks and limbs, most predominantly proximal. Lower limbs involve more. You may have fasciculations and tremors, polymyomyoclonus, which I'll be showing you in the video. And EPS may show abnormal spontaneous activity like fibrillations, and generally used to be taught on raindrops on tin roof. When you do the insertional activity, can be there. There can be fasciculations and all. So child is floppy grossly. You have a pull to sit. There is a lag. It's totally floppy child, and this is the tongue fasciculations. This is the polymyomyoclonus. So when these are present, they help supportive, in the clinical diagnosis. Now, how many % of children would have, presence of fasciculations? Up to 56% of children with SMA have been reported to have fasciculations, and polymyomyoclonus, the data is not available. And fasciculations are arise because of spontaneous depolarization of the low motor neuron. And polymyomyoclonus, the exact mechanism is not known. They are irregular, small amplitude myoclonic movements of the hands or fingers on an outstretched posture, as I showed in the previous video. Something I want to mention about CK, generally CK levels are normal in type 1 and type 2, but they may be elevated in type 3 SMA, and 90% of SMA type 3 may show elevated, especially the type B. And, usually the rise is 2 to 4-fold, not more than 10-fold rise. Just remember, not more than 10-fold rise. So elevation can be from up to 1,500 to 2,000. The exclusion criteria when we are clinically approaching a child with the hypotonia would be a weakness of extraocular muscles, diaphragm, and the myocardium with marked facial weakness, sensory disturbances, CNS dysfunction, arthrogryposis, other neurologic and other organs involved. As I mentioned to you, CK more than 10 times, upper lip normal, dystrophin deficiency, hexosaminidase, and if you are having reduction of motor nerve conduction velocities or abnormal sensory nerve potentials. The SMN mutations in the SMN gene are in the chromosome 5q13, and exon 7 deletion is found in 98% of them. And you can generally get on SMN, you do an MLPA, and you see for SMN whether there is a homozygous deletion, and also the SMN2 copy numbers. And I'll be mentioning about this subsequently about the significance of the copy numbers. So basically, when we are seeing a floppy infant or a floppy child, a floppy infant will have an isolated motor delay with maybe history of reduced fetal movements and polyhydramnias. There may be hypotonia and muscle weakness, predominantly proximal, and absent or decreased reflexes. In a floppy child, they may have a motor delay, maybe have difficulty in walking and climbing stairs, even hypotonia, muscle weakness, absent or decreased reflexes. Can other people just mute themselves? That would be helpful. When you have these features suggestive of SMA and no exclusion criteria, then we do an MLPA ideally. Some places where you don't have, then you may do a quantitative PCR, but MLPA is preferable. You do an SMN deletion, you take, and you see the copy numbers. So basically, when you have features suggestive of SMA and doing an MLPA, if you have 0 copy of SMN copy, then it's confirmed 5q SMA. If there is 1 copy or there are 2 copies, then you reevaluate the clinical profile, look for atypical features, Then you have to do a CK and nerve conductions and EMG and RNST. If there is a strong possibility of SMA and there is a neurogenic pattern, then we do an SMN targeted sequencing. Just remember that we have to do SMN targeting sequencing, not a whole exome sequencing. And if you are thinking reevaluation that the SMA may be unlikely, then you can have host lot of other conditions, including the motor neuron disease plus syndrome, which we will be alluding to subsequently. We have to do a whole exome sequencing in that case. So if you understand that one should keep in mind that SMN targeted sequencing has to be done following the MLPA when you have a strong suspicion of SMA. So it's classified as SMA type 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. 0 is generally a prenatal onset. They achieve no milestones and they die between few weeks to few months. And SMA type 1 is less than 6 months, and they may have head health can be unaided, and they are generally up to only 2 years they survive. SMA type 2 will be onset less than 2 months and may be sitters, and they can go up to second to third decade. SMA type 3, they can stand and walk, they can be walkers, and type 4 can be seen in adolescent and adulthood. And they have a normal, 3 and 4 may have normal life expectancy. So basically, functionally speaking, we have to classify them when we are assessing them as non-sitters, sitters, and walkers. Non-sitters will be SMA type 1, sitters will be SMA 2 or 3 who have lost ambulation, and walkers will be ambulatory SMA 3 and 4. Now coming to SMA types based on copy numbers, basically SMA type 1 will have 1 or 2 copy numbers of SMN2. SMA type 2 may have 3, and SMA type 3 will have 4 and more than 4. Basically, it has been seen the severity will depend basically on the SMN2 copy numbers will be there and will be important. But lately, we have seen that there are other modifiers like SURF1A and NAIP copy number variations, which affect the manifestation in cases, because some of the SMA type 1 will have copy number 1, some will have 2, some SMA 2 will be have 2 and 3. So the variation will be by these modifiers. And this is important to understand that these modifiers exist. And there was a recent study in which they had seen in Spanish patients, 625 patients they had seen and analyzed, and they had observed in this that there is a correlation with NAIP, specifically the neuronal apoptosis inhibitory protein, whether it is there on the chromosome, if you have the exon 5 deleted homozygous of NAIP, it has a worse prognosis. So this has to be kept in mind when we are seeing these children. What are the recent advances in treatment? So Cochrane has been done, and Cochrane review of 2019 of SMA type 1 has shown in 2 trials, including 131 patients, out of which 121 were in nusinersen and others in riluzole. They had shown that 73% of nusinersen treating group had shown improvement on CHOP intent functional assessment, and it was a positive, moderately certainty evidence, but with riluzole, it was inconclusive. The other Cochrane, which has been done for type 2 and type 3, which was published in 2020, in which 10 placebo-controlled RCTs were there, in which they have shown that nusinersen has beneficial effect on SMA type 2, but there was no effect found of creatine, gabapentin, hydroxyurea, phenyl butyrate, valproate, somatotropin, and TRH. And certain trials are awaiting the reports, of something like acetylcarnitine and riluzole and salbutamol and valproic acid. Few of the results are pending. So there have been a lot of drugs in the pipeline which have been there for SMA, which have been developing over the last so many years. Good part is the SMN2 is a backup gene. Normally in SMN2, there'll be 1 to 2 copies. SMN2 produces only 10% of the working protein as compared to SMN1. And we discussed that depending on the number of SMN2 copies, you had the manifestation. So what happens is in healthy individual, you have, SMN1, you're getting the active protein, and SMN2, you are getting an inactive protein because the exon 7 is getting deleted. So what happens in an SMA patient? Obviously, what is going to happen is in the SMN1 gene, you are not able to form at all. So, and in the SMN2, again, the exon 7 is getting deleted. So protein is unstable. So what can you do? So what we can do is, this is the SMN2 splicing modifiers. So because of the SMN and SMN2 and SMN1 are related by inverted gene duplication, SMN2 contains a C2T mutation in exon 7 that redirects the alternating splicing to exclude the exon 7 and leads to an unstable protein. So when one potential therapeutic strategy is to have a SMN2 splicing modifiers, which will ensure that there is inclusion of exon 7 in the SMN2 protein, so that there is a functional protein. So this has been the basis of many of the new treatments which are there. Nusinersen was FDA approved in 2016 for all types of SMA. It's an antisense oligonucleotide, and it has to be given intrathecally. Initially 4 loading doses, first 3 at interval of 14 days, and the 4th dose 30 days after the 3rd dose, and then every 4 monthly thereafter, lifelong. And some issues of thrombocytopenia and coagulation abnormalities and renal toxicities have been reported. And basically, as I mentioned to you, those children who are treated with, SMA, what happens is in the SMN2, because of this antisense, so then the exon 7 gets included and an active protein is formed. So this principle is utilized in nusinersen. Clinical trials have shown, India was the trial first in which, infantile onset SMA with SMN2 copies 2 were used, and they found that significant improvement in motor milestones in 50%. So early termination of trial was due to significant motor response, and the patients were then transferred into an open label trial called SHINE. And they said that early treatment may maximize the benefit of the drug. Then there was a CHERISH trial, which was for late onset SMA, more than after 6 months of age. And there was significant improvement in the score of the functional improvement on the motor scales. And there was early termination of trial because of the same. And the patients were transferred to an open label study named SHINE. Then NURTURE is an ongoing trial, expected completion February 2025. And they say that, they're targeting on the pre-symptomatic stage of SMA, the genetically diagnosed infants less than 6 weeks at first dose with 2 to 3 copies of SMN2. And they have shown in interim results that, some of them are having improvement. So there is that, the issue is that we should be targeting early and picking these children early and starting the treatment early. SHINE, as I mentioned to you, this is basically those 2 initial trials which have been given an open label extension, and these children are following up. DEVOTE is another ongoing study in which they are studying the escalating the intrathecal dosages and comparing to the 12 milligram trial. RESPOND is another trial which was started, recently, in which nusinersen is being given in patients who have been previously treated with Zolgensma, and Zolgensma is the gene therapy. So they are just seeing how combination is going to work. So this combination therapy part has been studied, and it has been studied in a cellular level. And they say, because it's an SMN2, there is it's a splicing modifier. What happens is, if there is something which is going to increase the SMN2 gene expression, is going to give more SMN2 to be available for the splicing modification. So this is a HDAC inhibitor, panobilobstat, which has been seen in a cellular model of SMA. And it has been shown to enhance the expression of SMN2. So when you have increased expression, then there will be more SMN2 or mRNA available for, further increasing the protein production by using antisense oligonucleotides. Further animal studies are going to be started now. There is a humanitarian access program. Biogen started it in 2016, came to India in 2019. And now in 2021, they have expanded to many sites. And they were initially using for type 1, 2, and 3. Right now, it is for type 2 and 3 children which they are using. And the contraindication is for, children who are, on prolonged ventilation and on who have scoliosis, because it's intrathecal administration. Now, coming to the gene therapy, it was approved on May 27, 2019. Patients less than 2 years of age of SMA were used, but this is the single dose treatment, which is the most expensive medicine in the market ever approved by FDA, $2.12 million, coming to 16 to 17 crores of rupees. And but the total cost of treatment with nusinersen during a child's life is more expensive than a single dose of Zolgensma. And we'll be coming to you subsequently whether the Zolgensma single infusion is going to last for how long. That is also another thing. It produces the working SMN protein, and the vector is AAV, and the target is motor neurons. So basically there's delivery of SMN into the vector, and then, it is ultimately gets maintained into the motor neuron cells. So there's a single dose intravenous infusions, and in that we have to monitor the LFTs, platelets, and troponin I, and we have, I'll be talking about in our experience that you have hepatic dysfunction and thrombocytopenia and trop I levels which are there. And one thing is there, you can't give in patients who have anti-AAV9 antibodies. And you need to prime them with steroids starting 1 day prior to giving the infusion to a couple of weeks after that, depending on the child's platelet counts in LFT. So the clinical trials which were there, which have been done, they have been STRIVE phase 3 and START phase 1 study, which is there. And basically STRIVE was there. It is an open label one in SMA type 1 with 2 SMN2 copies. And they found that 91% of patients were alive and did not need permanent breathing support at 14 and 18 months of age. And 59% could sit without help for at least 30 seconds at 18 months of age, which you don't expect otherwise. And they also found that, 100% of the patients were alive and did not need permanent breathing support. And similar trials have been going on in Europe and Asia Pacific region. These are intravenous. But there is another trial which is ongoing in which they're seeing the tolerability of the intrathecal infusion, keeping in mind that it has felt that giving intrathecally will be better. But the initially intravenous infusions were done because children were very small. You're trying to pick up early. So right now, the intrathecal infusion is being given in 6 months to 5 years old with 3 copies of SMN2. But then, it came on partial hold because there was some inflammation in the primates by giving Zolgensma by spinal cord infusion. There was another study which I told you we're starting on, they are starting now, everybody's talking about pre-symptomatic SMA 6 weeks or earlier. So this another trial is ongoing, and their reach is for older children. The question is single dose. You can't repeat the dose because once you've given, you get anti-AAV9 titers in a child, which is going to last a lifetime. So you cannot repeat the dose. So for how long it is going to last? So there is an open label phase 4 trial going on from February 2020 to December 2035. They're just trying to see for how long these patients are going to have the benefit lasting. And the START basically open label has shown 15 children who are alive at 2 years without requiring permanent ventilation, and 11 out of 12 are sitting unaided, and 10 of them are having a significant improvement in their scores. As I mentioned to you, the intrathecal infusion is being trying in the STRONG one, and the pre-symptomatic also trial is on. There is again a managed access program given by Novartis, which is through AVEXIS for Pan-India, and patients are being given this free of cost, and they are in less than 2 years of age. They are taking the patients for enrollment. So there have been health outcomes in children. They have been reported, and they have been a significant improvement has been reported. So it has reduced the pulmonary and nutrition support requirements, improved the motor function, and reduced hospitalization rate over a follow-up period. And so this is there has been a significant improvement which they have seen. Now, basically, it is there that how is this relative to the nusinersen. So this they did an indirect comparison, and they found that by the gene therapy we have an efficacy advantage relative to nusinersen for overall improvement in the requirement of permanent ventilation, motor function, and motor milestones. The other thing is whether you can have a combination therapy. Combination therapy with nusinersen and AVEXIS. They have shown that in the combination therapy in the children who have been given Zolgensma, who were already given nusinersen, there was some more hepatic dysfunction noticed in these children. So, but this thing is still to be on whether it is going to be beneficial. There are now new treatments are there, and we have to see how this combination will work. It becomes very difficult for us because of the cost. Risdiplam is the only oral drug, and this was FDA approved on 7th August 2020. And this is also an SMN2 splicing modifier. And this has been approved for children aged 2 months and older as of now. And the approval was based on 2 trials, Firefish and Sunfish. Firefish was from 2 to 7 months and Sunfish was with older children. And they have found not very significant side effects, or the fever, diarrhea was found. And mechanism of action is again the same. It's an SMN2 splicing modifier. And the trials which have been done, which have given, these were the trials because of which they got the approval, and which have shown that, there was a significant improvement in the motor functions by all of them, in these children after 12 months of treatment. So, and the safety was also very well established, both for infantile and later onset SMA. And then you have trials which are going on, for other exploratory trials for Risdiplam on those children who have already been given other therapies. That means a combination is being studied. And also this another trial is there to see whether you can give in the early childhood, less than 6 weeks of age. So basically all these trials were there, and this has just recently been published in NGM by the Firefish Working Group, and they have shown, they were studied with the 2 drug dosages, and they have found significant improvement in the increased expression of the functional SMN protein. There is the compassionate access is available for these children, but currently the enrollment is off, but they had given to many centers across India. Now coming to another drug, which is an open label study of Brunelopam, which is also a SMN2 splicing modifier, which has been tried in SMN type 1 patients. And we have studies yet to complete, and the results are not there. So basically SMN inducing therapies have been the nusinersen, which is again the SMN2 splicing inhibitor, which we talked about, modifier. And then you have the gene therapy, which is the viral mediated SMN gene replacement. Then Risdiplam was also a SMN2 splice modifier. And this Brunelopam is also that. You need the differences. It's intrathecal for nusinersen, intravenous for the, and one time for Zolgensma, and intrathecal for life, every 4 monthly for life. And Risdiplam is orally daily for life, and Brunelopam is once weekly, and that's also an oral drug. So basically these 4 will be there. Comparing the drugs, hello? Something happened? Sorry. I don't know what happened. Yeah. So comparing the drugs, if you see the cost, Spinraza is 4.2 crores in the first year and 2.1 crores per annum thereafter. And Zolgensma is 15 to 16 crores single time. And for Risdiplam is 2.4 crores per annum for a 20 kg child. So their costs are exorbitant as of now for us. It's very difficult to, afford. Now, very importantly, we should not forget, we cannot just be chasing all these definitive treatments. Yes, we should be, but we should not forget a multidisciplinary approach, including looking at the musculoskeletal growth and nutrition, pulmonary, cardiac, and other systemic evaluation, psychological counseling, pharmacological support which we can give, and physiotherapy, occupational therapy, and special education. Depending on the functional classifications that we have for non-sitters, there are protocols which have been as suggested, which are there to have a neuromuscular, orthopedic, nutrition, pulmonary, all this have to be monitored closely, and have to be given. You have to do the DEXA and all frequently, keeping the diet and all in there. And we have to also keep in mind the palliative versus proactive approach for these children. And the SMA1 patients have to be followed 3 monthly till the age of 1 year and 6 monthly thereafter. One has to keep in mind, if somebody's having severe bulbar dysfunction and all, we have to keep in mind about the palliative care options to be given to the parents rather than on having them on ventilator for long. And for sitters also, you have to, additional problem with sitters comes, you have to look for the scoliosis, and you have to keep monitoring the curb angle and provide the support. That has to be kept in mind. And walkers, again, you'll have to talk about the gait. That comes an additional thing for them in time. And we have to tell the parents and have to give them all the information regarding SMA to these parents. Genetic counseling is important. It's an autosomal recessive mode of inheritance, and recurrence risk is 25% if both parents are carrier. Carrier status of parents is important. Prenatal testing is done by amniocentesis and CBS. And if the parents have with more than one child confirmed with the homozygous exon 7, it depends whether both the parents have one copy of the deleted gene, it confirms the status. If exon 7 deletion is only in one, then the other parent may have 2 copies on the same chromosome. And if the parent has more than one child confirmed with the compound heterozygous exon 7 and point mutation, then one parent may have a deletion and other has an intragenic point mutation. But if the intragenic mutation is not found, then it could be germ cell mosaicism. And if there's only the first index case which is there, then both the parents have one copy deleted of the SMN1. You confirm the status, or if one parent has a deletion, then it must be that both of them are in the same chromosome. The carrier screening overall, it's 1:40 to 1:60. Asians have a highest rate, and SMA actually fits in the criteria for population-based genetic screening, as it's a clinically severe disorder with a high frequency, and you have a reliable test, you have genetic counseling, and you have prenatal diagnosis. So probably carrier screening can be thought of by after giving educational material to the parents and providers.
And like,
Coming
what is this
to-
woman doing traveling to Australia now? Is she crazy?
Can you please mute yourself, please, whoever is talking about Australia? Yeah. When just talking about our experience with SMA, we just done I earlier had done a carbapenem RCT, which was not found beneficial. Then we did valproate per levocarnitine. Can the organizer please mute others? It's very distractive. Can the organizer, host, please mute the others? So you have to, we did a RCT of valproate and levocarnitine, and we had not, that was also negative study. So for regarding the nusinersen, we had initially applied for 140 children in August 2019, out of which 13 children were selected for SMA type 2 were there, 10 and 3 SMA1, but one patient died before the Spinraza came. So we have 12 children on follow-up. For gene therapy, we have had 4 children who have been given. Risdiplam has been approved in 6, and recently Spinraza, we have had 38 patients accepted out of 45. So basically what the initial Spinraza, what we had given in the 12 patients, they have all have seen a significant improvement in their motor functions. And so SMA1 patients had no episode of respiratory complaints in the last 4 months. They had improved activity and reduced irritability. This was a child of SMA type 2 and who had received the first dose of Spinraza on 2nd of January 2020. And this one was there when the maintenance one was done. So the Hammersmith functional scale had increased from 20 to 36. She was creeping on stairs, but now she could pull herself from sitting to erect position to maintain the posture. So this was the difference. And this was the same child. I thought if the video doesn't play, I'll just show it pictorially. This was the another SMA type 2, whose score was 8, became 16, could sit without support and could raise his arms up to ear level at the maintenance first dose. Then this was the child with SMA type 1. I do not have a pre-therapy thing, but the child could lift her upper limb with elbow off the surface and could lift lightweight objects and partially roll over from supine to side, which the child could not do before Spinraza was started. Coming to gene therapy, we have had experience with 4 children, and these both children all have improved except one. And the first child, except one, because they had a lot of bulbar dysfunction. This was the first child who we had done on 29th May 2020. This was the first child in India to have received the gene therapy. So it was done by our genetics, our pediatric neurology division and genetics division combined, the part of Department of Pediatrics. And this child, you can see the pre-therapy video. This is the second child. So this was a third child. This child had a lot of bulbar dysfunction, and this child had been ventilated for long, even prior to getting the drug. The drug shipment was delayed because the child was on ventilator prior to this. And after this also, she had a stormy course. So all these 4 children are doing well. All of them had required a bit prolonged use of steroids because of developing thrombocytopenia initially, and had raised OTPTs, and TROP-I was also abnormal initially, but the OTPTs remained abnormal for a significant amount of time. But they are otherwise all doing well, except the third patient who has been there because he was ventilated, and even after, immediately after gene therapy also, about 2 weeks later, again got intubated because of bulbar dysfunction and still in the ward, although her gene therapy was done on 24th of December. So sorry, something happened. One sec. So basically, we have to understand that these few lucky people, our children, have been given the therapies, but we have to still be, doing all the multidisciplinary care for these children. It becomes very important for them. We should not forget that. Yeah, now just coming briefly, very, very briefly, that we have to talk about the SMA variants and the MND plus syndrome very briefly. We'll take another 2 minutes just to briefly mention them. Basically they are, basically there are a lot of proteins and all which are there. There are many genetic variants associated with this motor neuron disease, which can be there because of different proteins getting affected. You have different conditions, and in which you have predominantly the proximal muscle weakness, or you have a distal muscle weakness. With proximal muscle, if you have a respiratory weakness, vocal cord weakness, CNS manifestations, arthrogryposis, bulbar weakness, we can, think about different conditions which can be there. And if you have more distal involvement, we have different conditions. And this one is the riboflavin dependent one is present here. But they are all very, very rare conditions. We have to keep in mind that we have to see the pattern of weakness which is there, and seeing about the bulbar and respiratory involvement, try to do the electrodiagnostic investigations to establish the neurogenic basis, and differentiating between myopathy and neuromuscle junction, vision and hearing assessment. And you may need a neuroimaging of brain and spine because if you're having a central nervous involvement. You may like to do a muscle and nerve biopsies and metabolic tests if required. And anyway, ultimately ended up to do an NGS. And depending on the age of onset, we can think of various conditions.
Dr. Shafali, we are
I'm just winding.
So just please.
1 minute. So basically, just 1 minute, I'm ending up. Age at onset, you have to see, and then, various other systems involved. Just wanted to mention, that they are there and they are rare. They are rare, and the same flowchart which I showed, and if you may end up doing the whole exome sequencing to diagnose, and ultimately you have to give a multidisciplinary support, as we mentioned earlier. This was one patient I had taken, because just to say that we do see in India, this one is there by Dr. Ajit and Dr. Sumita from adult neurologist from CMC Vellore. They had this patient who was diagnosed as motor neuron disease, but had gynecomastia and bulbar weakness and tongue wasting and fasciculations, and it was diagnosed as a probable Kennedy syndrome, and the diagnosis had confirmed. So, but this is seen in adults. So basically we have to keep looking at it, and when we ultimately can diagnose, we have to empower our parents with all the condition details about the therapies, and everything has to be given to them in regional languages. And points to remember is you have to understand when to suspect, early diagnosis, near therapeutic options, yes, but most importantly, don't forget the multidisciplinary approach and management. Thank you so much for a patient listening. Sorry if I exceeded.
Thank you, ma'am, for this exhaustive and very lucid talk. I think it was very wonderful to see all these therapies happening in India, and your center, we are able to see these children are getting this therapy, and at least few of these are having some improvement in this condition. So it was really a very wonderful talk. Now I hand over to Dr. Shruti for the next session.
Thank you, Dr. I think they've had an auspicious beginning to this program. I would request all the participants to enter their questions in the chat box. We will address them at the end of all the 3 talks. Before I introduce the next speaker, let me thank the organizers, particularly Dr. Anne and ORDI, for having me for this very important webinar series. I'm honored and delighted to be here. Moving on, in the second session today, we are fortunate to have with us Dr. Manoj Menezes from Sydney, Australia. Dr. Menezes is a pediatric neurologist at the Children's Hospital at Westmead, Sydney. He is the director of Peripheral Neuropathy Management Clinic and co-lead of Neuropathy Research Group. Since the last 1 year, he is also the president of the Australia and New Zealand Child Neurology Society. His main clinical interests are in inherited neuropathies and has been awarded a PhD from University of Sydney and Churchill Fellowship for his work in inherited neuropathies. His current research interests include deep phenotyping of childhood inherited neuropathies and the research on understanding the cause of motor neuron degeneration in children with riboflavin transporter disorders in Sassoon Hospital, Pune. He has had an illustrious academic career and is a gold medal winner for his post-graduation. He has a fellowship in pediatric neurology through Global Health Program at UCLA. He has multiple peer-reviewed publications and has presented many papers in national and international conferences. I now welcome him to deliver his talk on congenital myasthenic syndromes. Welcome, Dr. Umesh.
I'm thank you, AOCN, ICNA, and ORDA for inviting me to give a talk on congenital myasthenia, our experience. And after the very interesting talks by Dr. Shefali as well as Dr. Manoj, anterior-onset disease and then neuropathy journey, and I'm going to talk next half an hour on the neuromuscular junction disorders, congenital myasthenic syndromes in children. So to start with the introduction, that it is a very heterogeneous group of genetic disorders which causes dysfunctions of the neuromuscular junction. And the incidence is very much less, almost 1 per 1 lakh. This one study from UK which showed 9.2 per million. So very less number of kids, they will have congenital myasthenia. Depending on the problem in the neuromuscular junction, whether it is presynaptic, synaptic or postsynaptic, it is classified accordingly. And one has to understand that it has varied presentations, different age of presentation. Some may present in neonatal age, infancy, while some may present in adulthood. And there is difference in pharmacological treatment response. So it is essential to understand this congenital myasthenia syndrome group. So in brief, in the first slide, I'll mention you about the neuromuscular junction transmission. It is essential to understand how it happens. After the action potential travels to the axons, there is introduction of the calcium in the presynaptic junction, which moves the synaptic vesicles to the membrane. Then there is docking, a release of acetylcholine in the neuromuscular junction, and this acetylcholine will get bind to the postsynaptic receptors, and then there is subsequent increase in sodium conductance with subsequent generation of the muscle epi. And when it is reached to the threshold, septum margin is reached, the action potential will be generated in the muscle and it will be conducted further. And after this acetylcholine in the synaptic junction will get cleaved, and this acetylcholine will again resynthesized, will go inside the presynaptic junction and will get fused in the synaptic vesicles. So this is the way the conduction happens across the neuromuscular junction. So accordingly, the congenital myasthenia has been classified. The genes which are associated with the presynaptic defect, they are classified as presynaptic congenital myasthenia, and the prototype is CHAT. And then there are other rare genetic mutations. Then whenever there is problem in the synaptic space, then it is the prototype is COL-Q, which causes acetylcholinesterase deficiency. And then the more rare forms like COL13A1 or laminin B2. Then postsynaptic is the most common among it is the primary acetylcholine receptor deficiency, and epsilon subunit is the most common mutation site. And whenever it causes kinetic abnormalities, then the phenotype can be fast channel or slow channel syndrome. And these receptors at the postsynaptic junctions are maintained by various proteins like DOX7, rhabsine, and then the more rare form like agarine, LRP4, and MuSK. So whenever mutation in these proteins, it also give rise to postsynaptic congenital myasthenia. And now with the new advances in the genetic diagnosis, we are getting more and more protein glycosylation defect, and which is causing various type of myasthenias, GFPT1, DPHT1, or various others. And these are rare, so I'm going to touch them in a brief way. So apart from slow channel syndrome, which is autosomal dominant, loss of function mutation, all other are autosomal recessive. This I already explained how the neuromuscular junction is formed. So I'll go to the approach when to suspect congenital myasthenia. In the first brief few slides, I will give approach, and then I will have case-based discussion. So most of the symptoms in congenital myasthenia are same like any element disorder. Like they will have decorous fetal movements, they may have feeding difficulties in the infancy, in neonatal floppiness. Apart from that, the more characteristic symptoms for congenital myasthenia are ptosis, external ocular muscle weakness. They may have fatigable weakness, which is more characteristic of neuromuscular junction disorders. Some may have joint contractures, arthrogryposis. Some may present in lateral life with delayed motor milestones, difficulty in climbing up and down. They may have difficulty in getting up, abnormal fatigability on exertion, and ptosis and ophthalmoplegia, and some may develop spinal deformities, and few rare type of congenital myasthenias can have wasting of the muscle groups. So in approach, one has to think strongly. One has to suspect neuromuscular junction in LMN weakness. Particularly, the weakness can be, if the weakness is with fatigability, one can have localized or generalized weakness, and one has to understand the variable age of presentation. And the most important is to, if you are suspecting a myasthenia, then whether it is genetic or acquired. So these are the few clues. Like in congenital myasthenia, they can present from neonatal age to adulthood. But acquired myasthenia in general, they are rare in infants. Like in our center, we saw more than 30 cases of acquired myasthenia, juvenile myasthenia, but none of them presented in less than 1 year. So if early age of onset, think about congenital myasthenia. Usually acquired will have ocular manifestations, then will progress to bulbar and very rarely generalized. But in congenital myasthenia syndrome, you can have varied presentations. Acquired usually may start with unilateral ptosis and then bilateral ptosis. In congenital myasthenia, usually it is bilateral. Congenital myasthenias can have contractures at the presentation. Acquired will never have contractures. And one interesting point is that whenever there is dorsal ankle dorsiflexion weakness, it favors more of a congenital myasthenia. Acquired congenital myasthenia will not have ankle dorsiflexion weakness. They will respond to pyridoxine, pyridostigmine. In acquired congenital, many phenotypes may respond, but few may get worsened. Antibodies will not be there in congenital, so they will be seronegative. But one has to remember that most of our acquired, particularly ocular myasthenia, pure ocular juvenile myasthenias may have negative antibodies, and the congenital myasthenias will not respond to immunotherapy. Acquired myasthenias rarely can have spontaneous remission, but not the congenital myasthenias. So important to remember all these things. And now because of the expanding genetic testing, we are having more and more genes diagnosed with congenital myasthenia. At present, there are more than 30 genes have been recognized, but among them, these 4 groups, they will have more than 60% of the cases among congenital myasthenic syndrome in the various centers. This is one good paper, recent paper. And in our single center, we had genetically proven around 12 cases of congenital myasthenic syndrome. Out of that, almost 50% cases are with the CHNRE receptor mutation. Then 2 cases each of DOX7 and presynaptic, and 1 each case of prapsin and COL-Q mutations. So this is my first case. This child was presented from the neonatal age. Initially, normal delivery, did not cry, admitted in NICU because of the floppiness. He was admitted in NICU for feeding difficulties for almost 1 month, and then he was discharged and gradually started evaluating for the floppiness. One can see the floppiness, generalized floppiness, a reflexia, but preserved cognition at the age of 1 year. See the truncal hypotonia, but not much ptosis, preserved cognition, and he was evaluated among the other causes of floppy neonate. We went ahead with EMG NCV. Surprisingly, there were no synapses recorded from the peripheral motor nerves. Only proximal motor nerves showed low amplitudes, and EMG was myopathic. For thinking about muscle disease with no synapse recorded, it is very unusual without that much wasting to have no synapse. So we thought whether it is a neuromuscular junction transmission defect, and his NMG showed at low frequency RNA showed abnormal decrement, and at higher frequencies there was some facilitation. So we thought it is possible to have a neuromuscular junction disorder could be presynaptic, as few presynaptic disorders have facilitation on high frequency. And so we started him on pyridostigmine, and within a few months he started sitting. His hand, his proximal muscle weakness has improved. Now he's raising his hands. Neck muscle control has improved. So he's sitting quite a lot. the feeding has also improved. The aspiration episodes have decreased. Now he's almost 6-7 months into the treatment, and there is significant improvement. And meanwhile, he was diagnosed with this presynaptic VAMP1 mutation, which was homozygous and pathogenic, and both the parents were carrier. So he had this synaptobremin 1 or VAMP1 mutation. I'm going to describe it further. Then this is another boy. He was presented again for hypotonia, delayed development, ptosis, some light color hair, and CPK was normal, and his RNS was also normal, and EMG was myopathic. So he had ptosis with EMG showing myopathic features. It's CPK normal, and he turned out to be a PREPL mutation. Again, it is a presynaptic congenital myasthenia syndrome. So he had this PREPL mutation. So these two cases. With these two cases, I'll discuss about the presynaptic congenital myasthenic syndrome. It can be divided into, it is rare. It can be divided into two main categories. One is with the synthesis of and recycling of acetylcholine, and the prototype is CHAT, and the other two mutations are SLC5A7 and SLC18A3. So it comes here with the synthesis and recycling of acetylcholine, and then packing of this acetylcholine into the synapses, packing this into the vesicles, and then docking it with the release of the neurotransmitter in the cleft. That is another group of proteins, which is called as snare protein. So these two groups are there in presynaptic congenital myasthenic syndromes, and this second group particularly shows facilitation on the fast RNS. So in the first group, CHAT is the prototype, which presents with the episodic apneas, respiratory crisis, and which improves with age. Other two types, SLC5A7 and SLC18A3, they have more severe presentation than CHAT, and they can have fetal akinesia with arthrogryposis. Again, they can have similar apneic crisis, and along with that, ptosis and ophthalmoplegias, and they will have particularly learning disabilities. SLC5A7 has also been described with distal HMN type 7. So there is some genotypic variations with the same gene. While type 2 in presynaptic is it is related with the snare complex that is soluble N-ethyl maleamide sensitive factor attachment protein, and this is required for the vesicle formation. And there are various proteins in this. They form the core, and mutations in these proteins can cause presynaptic congenital myasthenic syndrome. I have just described VAMP1 along with that. And then the other proteins are synaptogamine and the MUNC13. So CHAT, I have already explained, presents from birth to early childhood. Whenever the child any child in infancy will have respiratory failure or apneas, bulbar weakness, which is unexplained with other factors. Think about this presynaptic congenital myasthenias, and CHAT improves with age, and they are amenable to treatment with pyridostigmine or 3,4-DAP. I'm going to describe at the end about the treatment options. Other rare presynaptic synapses, just to touch them, I already explained about VAMP1 and PRPL. Among these, SNAP25 may have myasthenia, ataxia, epilepsy, and learning disability, while SIVT2 may have motor neuropathy. So EMG may not help in these conditions. One can have mixed picture. And then there are few case reports. These rare CHAT, these rare presynaptic congenital myasthenias have only 1 or 2 cases reported. LMA5 will have ptosis with respiratory distress, neck flexion weakness, and the same with the MUM13. I'll go ahead with the further type. Then we'll come to the synaptic type. This boy was presented at the age of 2 years. Now he's almost 5-6 year old, and he was presented with this ptosis, but there is not much external not much ophthalmoplegia. He has neck muscle weakness, scoliosis, and there was family history of one sibling died at the age of early infantile age because of the respiratory tract infection. And considering ptosis and this weakness, he was thought of possible neuromuscular junction disorder. One can see here the external ocular muscle, not much weakness, but there is definite ptosis, neck muscle weakness, and he is able to get up, minimal weakness while getting up. See the way he is getting up. So slightly turning to one side, but then is getting up, but there is neck muscle weakness. So here RNA showed postsynaptic blockade. CPK was normal. All other workup was normal. We did MRI brain as well as spine also. And salbutamol started for suspecting congenital myasthenia. And after 1 year, there was some improvement in his posture, his gait. Meanwhile, his mutation, COL-Q mutation came positive pathogenic, and there was some improvement with salbutamol. Is at present 2 milligram TDS of salbutamol. Although the scoliosis has increased, but other motor functions have been improved. The neck muscle weakness has also showed some improvement. We tried to procure epinephrine, but it is not available in India and did not get it. So at present he is on salbutamol. So in synaptic defects, COL-Q is the prototype. It requires for binding the acetylcholine, for functioning of the acetylcholinesterase in the synaptic cleft, and that causes too much of acetylcholine in the synapse. Usual presentation is early, infantile or neonatal. It causes generalized weakness. Tensilon test here can precipitate crisis. So one need to do tensilon test or neostigmine test in the hospital itself. There will be no response to pyridostigmine as there is already excess of acetylcholine, but they will respond to salbutamol or ephedrine beta agonist. And clinically, most of the time they are static or improves. And on RNS, on neurophysiological testing, one can have double synapse because of the excess of acetylcholine. COL-Q and slow channel mutation are the two only conditions where you will have double synapse like this. And then there will be end plate myopathy because of the excess of the acetylcholine. Then other defects are again very rare, so I'm just going to touch them. Like COL13A1, agrine. Agrine is also described with postsynaptic protein defect, and then LMB2. So they also present in the same way. Particularly LAM2 will have hypoplastic macula and nephropathy. So that is about synaptic, touching the synaptic congenital myasthenia syndrome. And then the prototype postsynaptic, this case 4, this child was presented at the age of 2.5 years with ptosis since infancy and some difficulty in getting up. So proximal neck muscle and truncal weakness, she's turning on one side and then getting up. Fatigable weakness. Now in such cases, sometimes it is difficult to differentiate whether they are acquired or they are congenital. The child was seronegative for antibodies. CPK was normal. And here then reviewing the old pictures, like this is a neonatal picture, which is showing ptosis. Then this is at the age of 1 year, again showing ptosis, helps us concluding that this could be congenital myasthenia syndrome. So reviewing the old pictures is another way to see if really the ptosis was there from the beginning, because acquired myasthenia usually will not have presentation in less than 1 year. RNA showed abnormal decrement. One can see there is more than 10% decrement in the baseline at lower frequencies. And so she was started on pyridostigmine. She showed improvement. You can see in the first picture pre-treatment and the second picture post-treatment. And she had this pathogenic mutation in CHRNE homozygous. Both the parents were carrier. These are another two cases. This is again to highlight the phenotype of CHRNE. Case 5, both the videos showing there is ptosis, there is some ophthalmoplegia. So ophthalmoplegia is a feature of postsynaptic receptor mutation. See the restriction of the abduction of the eyes on both sides. This is another child with ptosis, external ophthalmoplegia, and this is his old video at the age of 1 year, which is showing the ptosis. This child also had the CHRNE mutation, homozygous mutation. So this is because of the reduced number of acetylcholine receptor in the postsynaptic cleft. So we saw this group just now. So the highlights about ICGR deficiency. This is the most common. Most patients may have feeding difficulties. Ptosis at birth will be there. Ophthalmoplegia may not be there in infancy, which develops over the first year. It is because of most of the time epsilon subunit mutation. The gamma subunit is present in the fetal life, which get converted into the epsilon subunit in the late gestation. weakness may worsen with intercurrent infection, but the acute crises like apneic episodes with the CoLQ and the presynaptic phenotypes will not be there in the AChR deficiency congenital myasthenias, and they will respond to pyridostigmine with or without addition of 3,4-DAP. This is case 7. So this girl was presented with difficulty in getting up in infancy. She had Gower sign, no facial weakness, CPK was mildly raised, EMG was myopathic, but somehow the RNA showed some abnormal decrement. So we thought it could be LGMD spectrum. See here, no ophthalmoplegia, no facial weakness. And she found to have this DOX7 mutation. Both parents were heterozygous carrier. She was started on salbutamol. See here the first video. And within 6 months of treatment, she started running. Definitely improved function. So this is one of the most, in my experience, most rewarding congenital myasthenia with very good recovery. See the way she is jumping and the way she is getting up within 1 year. And salbutamol is easily available. So she had a DOX7 mutation, which presents predominantly with limb girdle and axial distribution of weakness, mild facial weakness, ptosis may not be there. No extraocular muscle weakness or ophthalmoplegia, and some patients may worsen with cholinesterase inhibitor. So there are only 3 conditions where one should take care of pyridostigmine: CoLQ, DOX7, and slow channel mutations. All other will respond to pyridostigmine. In slow channel syndrome, just to touch, it is only dominant mutation, gain of function mutation, and they may present with in the neonatal, but it is rare. Most of the time presentation in the first decade, repetitive CMAP, in-plate myopathy that happens with CoLQ is with slow channel, because here the channels are opened for prolonged period. So again, it behaves like excess of acetylcholine. Extraocular muscles are spared, and they respond to the open channel blockers like fluoxetine and quinidine, pyridostigmine to avoid. Fast channel is just opposite to the slow channel. Here the channels will be open only for a brief period, and it is very difficult to diagnose them on RNS, or one need to do the genetic testing, and it has to be in the kinetic has to be explained with the genetic mutations with the models. They also show response to cholinesterase inhibitors and 3,4-DAP. Then other rhabsine is also another one of the common mutation among postsynaptic congenital myasthenia. They will present with arthrogryposis in 1/4 of the patients. Respiratory insufficiency precipitated with intercurrent infections. EMG RNS may be absent or mild, and ophthalmoparesis is only 25%. Then other protein glycosylation defect like GFPT1, which will have like most of the protein glycosylation defect will present like a limb girdle weakness. They may have multi-system involvement. CPK may be elevated in 1/4. In DPA GT1, again the limb girdle distribution, like it is a protein glycosylation defect. One can have congenital malformations, and they might have isoelectric focusing pattern abnormality in the serum transferrin, and they will also improve with cholinesterase inhibitors. Then another rare is laminin B2, which presents with nephrotic syndrome, which is described in synaptic also. The plectin, these are the new genetic defects we are getting now. It is also called as plectinopathy, particularly with epidermolysis bullosa simplex muscular. It is also called as EBS MD, that is epidermolysis bullosa simplex muscular dystrophy, and the age of weakness on onset ranges from neonatal period to the early adulthood. It is progressive, and they are usually refractory to cholinesterase inhibitors. Now, this is recent paper which explained by Stephen et al. In 2019, and they found that many congenital myopathies may have secondary NMG disorders, and rarely they may respond to pyridostigmine. And this is again opened up many new genetic mutations in myopathies which may respond to the pyridostigmine. Like in this case, this is a sibling autosomal dominant RYR mutation, and as I already mentioned, few myopathies, they may respond to pyridostigmine. This sibling started on pyridostigmine, and see within 6 months, this girl, there is significant improvement in the getting up time. So significant improvement in the weakness. So some Congenital myopathies, they may have secondary NMG disorders and these required further evaluation. There are many papers like a paper from Rodriguez and Netara, they have TPM mutation myopathy and it responded to pyridostigmine. So worth sometimes to use pyridostigmine in such myopathies. So last few slides, principles of treatment in congenital myopathy. One has to congenital myasthenic syndrome. One has to remember that certain drugs can treat both. Certain drugs can both treat or harm patients. So one should be familiar with the genetic diagnosis of the congenital myasthenic syndromes. There are two treatment strategies depending on the group. One group will have decreased acetylcholine and another group will have increased acetylcholine in the congenital myasthenia syndrome like CoLQ and slow channel mutations. So there are three categories of agents used for the treatment of congenital myasthenic syndrome. The first category is cholinergic agents like pyridostigmine, 3,4-DAP, which will increase the ability of acetylcholine in the NMJ. Second category is long-lived open channel blockers like fluoxetine and quinidine. And third channel is adrenergic agonist like salbutamol or ephedrine. So pyridostigmine is used for many of the congenital myasthenic syndrome apart from slow channel, CoLQ and DOX7. I already explained the mechanism. It prevents the acetylcholine hydrolysis and hence more acetylcholine is available. Pediatric dosing is up to 4 to 6 milligram. One has to start at very low dose like 1 milligram per kg per day and then gradually go up to 4 to 6 milligram in 4 to 6 divided doses. Rarely may require little higher doses. Gastrointestinal symptoms to be monitored. 3,4-DAP, diaminopyridine, which is a potassium channel blocker and which increases the calcium entering the nerve terminal and hence it helps in releasing more acetylcholine quantum. The pediatric starting dose is 0.25 to 0.5 milligram per kg per day, divided it again 4 doses. And perioral and acral paresthesias are frequently reported with each dose. Seizures can manifest with 3,4-DAP, since it is essential to do EEG to look for any seizure propensity before starting 3,4-DAP. Very interestingly, it was initially a free drug under a compassionate use program till 1990s and 2000, and then now it is a patented drug available as Fildapsy or Ruzurgi, and it is quite costly at present to procure it.
Dr. Umesh,
Salbutamol,
sorry, we are running short of time.
only 2 minutes,
Sorry.
last 2 minutes. Last one or 2 minutes only. Salbutamol or ephedrine, these are mainly used for CoLQ and DOX7 congenital myasthenia. Weeks to months are required for the effects, and importantly, they may used as an add-on in other congenital myasthenias like acetylcholine receptor deficiency, slow channel, or other myasthenias. Usual doses up to 2 milligram. TDS in childhood, in adults it is up to 4 milligram, and the side effects to be monitored are tachycardia, palpitations, hypertension. Ephedrine, which is not available in India, the dose is 10 to 30 milligram per day. Slow titration is required. Then last group of drugs, fluoxetine and quinidine, they are used for slow channel myasthenia. Fluoxetine, which is available as 20 milligram per 5 ml syrup or tablet as 20 milligram. The starting dose is 20 milligram. One may need to go up to 80 milligram. But the side effect to be monitored is psychiatric manifestations like suicidal ideation in adolescent group. Quinidine, the dose is 50 to 60 milligram per kg per day in 4 to 6 doses, and arrhythmias to be monitored. So in general, whenever you suspect congenital myasthenia, and if you are not thinking about the DOX7, CoLQ or slow channel, start with pyridostigmine or otherwise avoid it. If you are suspecting DOX7, CoLQ or slow channel, then start with salbutamol. One can add ephedrine or fluoxetine afterwards, and then stress the genetic diagnosis. So this slide I already explained that 3,4-DAP acts for the calcium, acetylcholine esterase, then open channel blockers, and then the beta agonist. So last slide about the pharmacotherapy, which I already explained. Only thing what is required to remember is that pyridostigmine to be avoided in slow channel, DOX7 and CoLQ. So the last slide, key points. Congenital myasthenic syndromes are rare but underdiagnosed, so should suspect. There is no immune abnormality, so they will not amenable to the immunotherapies. Although they present typically in infancy, but can have presentations in adulthood. it is worth pursuing a definitive diagnosis since this guides prognosis, genetic counseling, and most importantly, treatment choice. Drugs can treat or worsen specific type of CMS. I have already explained the drugs. Next generation sequencing continues to expand the number of genes and proteins harboring mutations that can cause CMS. So this is about the congenital myasthenia syndrome approach in childhood. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Umesh, for this wonderful presentation. This was a complex topic with more than 33 genes till now identified for CMS, and it is really difficult for us to memorize individual phenotype of these patients. So an algorithmic approach is really what is needed to make a diagnosis in these patients. So thank you very much for your presentation. So now we open the Q&A session for this all the three presentations. I'll start with the questions. For first, we'll take some of the questions for SMA. The questions are for Dr. Shefali. Ma'am, the first question has been asked is, what is the role of SMN, what is the impact of SMN1 gene duplication if we found in kind of this
Yeah, SMN gene
reports?
duplication has been found in reports with associated with progressive muscle atrophies, they have been found in those situations.
Okay, so in that case, like if the phenotype is very clear of SMA, so what is your approach, ma'am, to go for SMN2 gene copy numbers or you directly?
First, whenever, as I mentioned to you in the slide, which I had shown that, you have to do first MLPA for SMN1, and in whether it's homozygous or not, deletion will be seen. If it's 0 copies, it's diagnosing of that. If you have 1 copy of that in all, and then you relook into the case, and then you have to get a SMN focused, testing. SMN targeted testing you have to be done. And if suppose you have some doubts that it could be any other condition and MND plus and all the SMA plus, then you go for whole exome. So you don't have to go, you first have to do MLPA. MLPA will give you the SMN1 as well as SMN2 copy numbers. And if you're not able to diagnose, then you have to go to a SMN1 targeted sequencing. That is very important.
How frequent is these compound heterozygous point mutations, ma'am? So almost literature suggests that it is almost 95% are deletions only.
Yeah,
so
they are
in your
rare.
experience, how many times you have seen that compound heterozygous?
They are very rare. They are very rare. They're very rare. Out of the whole lot which we have been seeing, we don't have that many who have. They're only because 95% will be diagnosed with the waste of deletions only.
Right,
So
right.
so I think it's not that common at all. We don't have that many patients. Yes.
Okay, ma'am. Next question is regarding the therapeutics in SMA. So it has been asked that all these SMA therapeutic agents, are they really lead to prolongation of life, or they are associated with improvement in functional capabilities?
Renu, I wanted to share the screen. You know what happened when my slide went off? The post gene therapy videos were not seen. That's why you could not make out the impact on the lifestyle of the line. Just take a minute to just show, because otherwise the impact is not clear. So this was I've just put the gene therapy video pre and post. Actually, it got missed when my slide had finished, so I mean, I've gone to the end. So this was the pre-therapy of the first child, which I had shown, because pre-therapy I had shown, the post-therapy I had not, but I put them together right now so that you can understand. So this was the pre-therapy. He's not having good head control also at all, is not there. Then this is post-case therapy after 2 weeks. This was the one I told you. Now he could turn over, he could sit down and put the rings. I'm going to just go fast because then, it will be simpler. This is 24 weeks photograph. He could momentarily sit without support. And then this is at 32 weeks. See, he's sitting without support for long. And, and in all the studies which have been shown, they're seeing at 12 months and 24 months sitting momentarily without support. That has been the endpoints, and not requiring ventilation. This was a second child. This was the second child. This was pre-therapy. So this is post-therapy, if you see. This is post-therapy at week 12. Now you can see he's starting to get some amount of trunk control. This is case 3 pre. This I had shown. The pre ones I had shown, the post one got missed. So I've just put them together so that you have an idea. So case 3, after 7 weeks. This is the child I told you was ventilated. even prior, and then was so the child had lost all milestones because of the prolonged ventilation. But now you see at 7 weeks, despite being on ventilator and all, could lift against gravity, the limbs. The fourth patient, pre-gene therapy is there, and post-gene therapy at 2 weeks. So you can see is going to started picking up the ball and do. So basically, it is not only, it is not just improvement little bit or prolonging life. You are having functional improvement, and all the studies have shown sitting for this SMA type 1, sitting without support for a few seconds or so at 12 months and at 24 months. So that is, you don't expect that of SMA. So I'm sorry that slides got missed when I just pressed the wrong button and went end and it got missed. So I think that will understand that they have a, but the issue is twofold. Whether this thing will last beyond 5 years, up to 4 to 5 years, we know the gene therapy is going to, the effect will be there or not. The long-term 15-year study is not started. So that we don't know. And you can't repeat the gene therapy because the anti-AAV9 antibodies which form are going to last a lifeline, and they are a contraindication. Even in general population, we have 30% of them having antibodies. And that's why we have we lost one patient, was rejected because of that. And the other thing, when we saw these are more dramatic improvement with gene therapy rather than with the Spinraza. But the point is they have to be continued lifelong. And that becomes important. And somebody has put the query about the cost. The cost is because, all of the studies and all done, that's the cost is because of that. But then we have to see, and there is a possibility that for developing countries like ours, they will be putting them with a lesser cost. And although, this $2.1 million looks very, very huge, but I showed you in one of my slides that the total cost of Spinraza in a lifetime would cost more than this one-time cost of the gene therapy thing. And, for the SMA type 2 and 3, there have been studies of using intrathecal, Zolgensma for the gene therapy. So that may last for a longer time. So maybe, if the intrathecal comes, then maybe right.
So the message is loud and clear here with your videos, ma'am. That's really nice to see that functional milestones have been achieved in these children with therapy.
Yes.
So like independent sitting, and if you see type 1 SMA raising his elbow, means definitely there is a really gain of milestones is there. And they are really functionally meaningful milestones are for these patients.
The first patient who had on 29th May 2020, he's now sitting momentarily without support. So I mean, we have seen gradually there has been improvement. So that is there. The only thing is how long it will last will become an issue. I mean, we'll have to follow up in that long-term studies, and whether the intrathecal one, and other thing is for coming the cost coming down. And the other question was that ultrasound, whether ultrasound can do. We have been doing studies on doing ultrasound for evaluating hypotonic children, yes, but you don't need to do all that for SMA, because SMA, first thing we do, go ahead and do with the genetic testing only. We do the MLPA, so we do not do that. But ultrasound has been found to be more sensitive for picking up fasciculation than ALS. Because it sees not only the superficial but also the deep muscles, and it also in the EMG it takes about 70 to 90 seconds, but in this, in even 10 seconds, an ultrasound they pick up. So the pickup rate of ultrasound for fasciculation is very good, but we are not using it for SMA because we directly go in for MLP.
Dr. Renu, you were on mute.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am, for your answers. Now over to Dr. Shruti for further Q&A session.
Thank you, Dr. Renu. Dr. Manoj, the questions are for you. Once again, a fantastic session. And the question that is asked is, how much does CMT resemble a polygenic condition like hypertension and diabetes? Because so many genetic loci are affected in them. You are on mute, sir.
Sorry about that. To date, all the mutations that have been identified are in single genes or copy number variations in these genes. There has been a lot of work that's being done to see if there is double trouble. So mutations in two genes, sometimes along the same pathway, can cause a problem. But increasingly, we are recognizing that the pathomechanism of these disorders relates to networks. So it is possible that a combination of genes or abnormalities in 2 or more genes may cause CMT, but it's not going to be the primary model of many of these are monogenic disorders, but it is possible that for a small number of the diseases where we haven't CMTs, where we haven't found a cause, abnormalities in 2 or more genes or networks may be a possibility.
Thank you. So you were speaking about EMG using nitrous oxide for children. So we find EMG is very challenging in children. So I am interested in hearing how you use this awake anesthesia.
Yeah, I mean, we use the nitrous oxide. We do it on an outpatient basis, 2 hours of fasting, then nitrous. We get an added benefit, especially for both completing our protocol of nerve conduction studies. We do RepStim, then go on to do the EMG. Sometimes we lighten the nitrous for EMG because we like to get some voluntary movement, but we have found it very, very useful. And it appears in some lists of neuropathic agents, but that's only when it's abused on a daily basis. When used for single tests, very, very safe. So I just want to know if any other centers have used nitrous as a quick and easy method of conscious sedation for EMG.
So we use mostly oral sedatives. We do not use nitrous oxide. Any other centers are using, madam? AIMS, PGI? And it's, EMG is also even more difficult. I suppose in CMT you don't need it much, but for to distinguish myopathies and neuropathies, anti-nephrotic disorders, we often have this problem. We get a moment of EMG there.
Sure.
There's one more question. How often do you have to resort to nerve biopsy nowadays for CMT?
Unfortunately, very rarely. It was a great area of interest of mine, because it takes you right down to the underlying abnormality when you look at these biopsies. But I guess fortunately for everyone and patients now, our genetic testing has improved so greatly that now in a year I would do 2 or 3, and mainly the role nowadays is to distinguish from acquired neuropathy. Sometimes we have children who present with a subacute onset, and we are not clear on whether it could be genetic or acquired, especially in the demyelinating neuropathy. So sometimes before we start steroids and the nerve biopsy picture changes, we do a nerve biopsy, a simple sural nerve biopsy to make sure to see if there's lots of perivascular infiltration. But I think that's the only role nowadays, apart from very difficult undiagnosed cases for nerve biopsy.
Sometimes in the busy clinic, I find that the easiest way is to just do the nerve conduction of parents, and that we sometimes miss out. And that can, this, your opinion?
I agree completely with you. When we have patients coming into clinic, especially the ones with demyelinating, we often do the accompanying parents. You show that the parent also has a motor conduction velocity of 15 meters per second. It's very likely they're going to have CMT1A. So I think really we should think of nerve conduction studies as a part of the phenotyping of a single patient, and that includes, examining the parents and doing their nerve conduction studies. I found it useful too.
Thank you. Dr. Umesh, did you have any question to ask? I thought you raised your hand.
No. This is very innovative idea to use nitrous oxide. Even we haven't used in our neurophysiology lab.
Thank you for that. Dr. Umesh, now I'll move to you. There are a few questions on CMS. So how do you decide on how to treat the patient based on clinical phenotype of CMS? So what medicine to start?
I think when you are suspecting congenital myasthenia syndrome, particularly, sometimes it is tricky to start with cholinergic agents like pyridostigmine. So you can start with salbutamol. As I already mentioned, most of the myasthenia syndromes, they are amenable to salbutamol, which is easily available syrup form as well as tablet form. And then asking them to have a pictures, regular pictures, because and then monitor the child, because genetic test may takes 1 or 2 months before we'll come to the conclusion. So starting with the salbutamol is a safer mode of starting a treatment.
Sure. So how early do you find a response to salbutamol once you start it?
At least after some 8 to 12 weeks, you will start seeing some improvement. If it is there, the pictures pre and post or videos pre and post salbutamol will help. And in our cases, we found that even after 6 months of treatment, they will keep on improving. Like for that cold Q, only the scoliosis is worsening still, but the other symptoms definitely is showing improvement. So I think it may take months for this beta agonist to have effects on the myasthenia phenotype.
Thank you. And the next question is, if acetylcholine receptor antibodies are positive, would it definitively roll out CMS?
Now this is a dual way question, because acetylcholinesterase and acetylcholine receptor antibodies, if it is positive, clinical history is suggestive, it suggests acquired myasthenia. But one has to keep in mind that most of our labs are doing ELISA based, very rarely RI based acetylcholine receptor antibodies, and they particularly ELISA based can be falsely positive, particularly ELISA based. So in such cases, it has been described to do cluster acetylcholine receptor antibodies if it is not matching with your myasthenia. But overall, if you are having a clinical history suggestive of acquired myasthenia, seropositivity, then we will take it as an acquired myasthenia. If we have seen positive acetylcholine receptor antibodies in GBS also. So one can have false positive acetylcholine receptor antibodies, and usually these are non-pathogenic, maybe directing towards the acetylcholine receptors intracellular epitopes. So one has to take into consideration these factors.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In adults, we find it positive for many unrelated conditions. We have to match it with the clinical phenotype. Would you consider just giving steroid if this AChR comes positive, rather than giving? Would you give that? Just steroid?
Yeah. In acquired myasthenia, you're asking? Yeah.
No, if the patient has a phenotype, a juvenile patient comes with a myasthenic phenotype.
I think this is a good question, because whenever we are suspecting acquired juvenile myasthenia, most of the time they present with ptosis, and it is last year we had Professor Dr. Sandeep Jaywant also with us, and he also emphasized to start early immunotherapy for these kids. Start at low dose of steroids, gradually titrate over a few weeks to the maximum effective dose. One can add on pyridostigmine with this, but the basis is the immunotherapy. Starting early immunotherapy is very important, because they may go into spontaneous remission because of the treatment.
I think it also helps as a therapeutic challenge and see whether they respond only to steroid or not.
Yeah, that is also one thing.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting case-based approach that you showed, and a very wealth of cases you have with you, all the presynaptic ones. Very rare to find.
Thank you very much.
So, Dr. Manoj, there is one more question for you. So it's regarding the outcome measures for pediatric CMT. How easily are they available? I mean, as we have for SMA and DMD, are there any easily available measures that we have?
Yes, all of those outcome measures are based on currently available other tests. For example, our CMT pediatric scale uses things like 9-hole peg test, functional dexterity, just dynamometry, upper and lower limbs, and then the 6-minute walk test and the BOT2 for your balance, and the same for our infant scale. The measures are ones that you have used with other conditions, things like upper limb function, the duration of sitting, gait. So very soon we will have them up on websites with training videos for the CMT pediatric scale. It takes us between 25 and 40 minutes to administer this thing. And we have seen that it is a very nice way of documenting the natural history in an individual patient. And hopefully once we get to clinical trials, they'll be the outcome measures. So as soon as this is available, we'll publish the websites for these outcome measures, and hopefully everybody can do these and get your patients onto the registry.
I agree with you that a national registry at least should be formed because, an effective therapeutic trials can only be given with a large number of cases. We have all that seen the problems with DMD with very few cases.
So in the INC, we have a minimum data set, a simple number of thing, and you use your outcome measures, so CMT, NSV2 in adults, CMT PET. And that's the whole idea behind the AOINC. We share these resources, outcome measures, and then you keep your data to yourselves. You don't need to share it, but still we are collecting data in the same way. So once we have national registries and when we start to collaborate more, we have collected data in the same way. That's the idea behind the AOINC.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Shruti, I just had two small comments to make. One is that limb girdle, presentation can be there for myasthenic syndrome, some of the congenital myasthenic ones, and people have to keep in mind, sometimes because they can say diagnosed as limb girdle muscle dystrophies, and then you find out that it's a congenital myasthenic syndrome. One, and number two, that for India and other LMIC countries, we are just going to launch as a part of a center of excellence, a registry, which is comprehensive registry with all neurological and neurodevelopmental, including neuromuscle disorders. So that will be launched very soon. So
that's a great news. In fact.
Yeah. Thanks.
Much needed. There is just one more question. So how would one differentiate between muscular dystrophy and late onset congenital myasthenia? Dr. Umesh, would you like to?
Yeah. First thing, as I already mentioned, that few congenital myasthenic syndrome phenotypes, they may present with limb girdle type of weakness, particularly DOX7, then protein glycosylation defect. So here, but most of them will have some ocular symptoms or ophthalmoplegia or some bulbar weakness. So sometimes it is clinically might be difficult, but if these features are there, then you may not get findings on the RNS, and then ultimately one has to go ahead with the genetic testing to differentiate most of them. And I think as more and more genetic mutations we are getting this spectrum between muscular dystrophies and the neuromuscular junction disorders, it is getting more and more diluted. So like few LGMDs, they are now classified into congenital myasthenia syndrome. Few congenital myasthenia syndromes, they are having overlapping muscular dystrophy like presentation, like this plectinopathy. It has epidermolysis bullosa, muscular dystrophy, and now it is also comes under the congenital myasthenia syndromes. And same thing is happening with congenital myopathies also. So these genes mutations, they have varied phenotypic presentations. That's why it is sometimes difficult to classify them into a particular group, either neuromuscular or LGMD. But overall, one should think about DOX7 in LGMD because it is treatable. So if you are suspecting, give a trial of salbutamol.
Exactly. So I think the main, sorry, madam, please, your points.
I just wanted to add, from some patients, what we have seen, they may have fluctuating weakness, not diurnal, over days to weeks. So, I mean, that also may be a subtle point that you may be there. So that is how, you can suspect. If you are having fluctuating weakness, but not diurnal, it is over days to weeks, the fluctuations take place. Yeah.
Yes. And in adults, actually, we have seen three things to be important. One is to keep on suspecting it. Keep your options open. Unless there are, definite features of muscular dystrophy, do not diagnose a dystrophy unless you are convinced of it. Secondly, you need to do an RNS from a weak muscle. So sometimes we do it on a standard muscles and we don't get it. And we need to test for fatigability again, historically weak muscles. This is how, we have missed and later on picked up CMS. Dr. Anne has raised a hand. Would you like to contribute?
And just adding on, thank you, Dr. Umesh, but just adding on, Dr. Shruti, you had asked about immunomodulation. Dr. Umesh had pointed out, we had a really nice talk from Sandeep Jayawant about updates in the way we manage it. So much so that in autoimmune, the acquired myasthenia, if it's only ocular, many of them we think are self-limiting. We are now not giving prednisolone or steroids with only ocular. Correct me if I'm wrong. For the simple ones, only the ocular ones, so they resolve by themselves. Because once you start immunomodulation, we are supposed to do it really aggressively for a longer period of time. We're talking about 6 months, 1 year longer. If you do, you can't do, stop and do. So either wait and watch, or if you do, you do it properly. That was the message that we got away from last time. Wasn't that right, Dr. Luke? From Dr. Sandeep Jaivan?
Yeah. But only thing that if you have seropositive acquired myasthenia, so will you wait for that ocular myasthenia?
Yeah, it's
Okay,
worked.
yeah.
That's
That's
what he said.
correct. Sometimes they have spontaneous resolution. Yeah.
I changed my practice after that. And
Yeah.
I looked up some of the guidelines, and they're okay. The students are
Yes.
okay without us giving them steroids.
Thank you. So I think we have had an excellent beginning to this webinar. It was a privilege and pleasure to listen to all these eminent speakers, and the input from the audience was also very stimulating. I think we have exceeded the time a bit, but we have gained a lot of knowledge from that exceeded time. With the permission of my co-chair, I would now hand it over to the organizers. Thank you, all the speakers, and all the delegates who have participated and listened to this with patience. And Dr. Ann, can we now declare this closed, or would the organizers like to add a few points?
No, it's okay. Prasanna, on to you.
No, nothing, ma'am. Let's close it. Already it's too much of time. I think it was a good beginning. Thank you so much for all your moderating the session.
So thank you very much. I will echo what is written here, a brilliant session.
Thank you, Dr. Shruti and
Thank
Dr.
you.
Selva. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
both of you.
Good
And thanks
night.
to all our speakers, especially Dr. Manoj for staying way past midnight. Thank you.
It's okay. It was a privilege to be part of this. The only other thing I'd like to say is you're all working in very challenging situation there. So I commend all your hard work, and I hope that the situation improves very quickly there. So all the best, and thank you for inviting me.